to the fifth episode of the Social Network Society podcast. The Social Network Society is a community aimed to foster meaningful connections amongst scholars engaged in research, teaching, and practice of social networks.
In this podcast series, we'll spotlight recently published peer-reviewed articles and uncover more about the fascinating world of social networks through the lens of authors.
This podcast is brought to you by the Social Network Society Communications team and is sponsored by the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Your hosts today are Tomova Shakur, Assistant Professor in the Management and Leadership Department at Texas Christian University.
Danny Yin, Assistant Professor at Penn State.
And Arushi Aggarwal, a fourth-year PhD student at the Management Department of ESSEC Business School in Paris.
So Elizabeth, thank you for joining us. Today we have the honor of talking to Elizabeth Campbell, who is an assistant professor at UC San Diego. She will chat with us about their recently published paper at AMJ with Catherine Shea, an assistant professor at Carnegie Mellon University.
The paper is titled The Gendered Complexity of Sponsorship, How Male and Female Sponsors Shape Their Social Network Strategies, and the authors examine male and female sponsors' goals and their impact on their approach to activating resources in their social network. They find that men approach sponsorship with less complexity than women. Namely, male sponsors are more likely than female ones to perceive sponsorship as an opportunity to benefit themselves, while female sponsors perceive sponsorship as an opportunity to benefit their proteges.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for being here today. We're very excited to chat with you.
Thanks so much for having me. I think it's a great opportunity to give insight to, the publication process. And when I was a student, I would have loved to hear insights from people on the other side. So glad you're doing this.
First, we thought we would start with some intro questions, such as how did you get into the profession? And did you always want to be an academic?
Yeah, so it's I think we talked about this a little bit, Thea. So for those of you listening, Thea and I actually met back in grad school. But it's funny, I didn't always want to be a professor. When I was in college, I actually thought I wanted to do clinical psychology. And so I did all of this research experience in clinical settings. And then at some point my senior year, I had some sort of existential crisis and decided it was not a good fit. And then I ended up going into market research where I did, more traditional kind of corporate market research type of tasks. And it was actually working in that workplace that led me to become interested in kind of gender dynamics and career advancement more broadly. And that's what kind of sparked my interest in going into OB programs and that sort of research. But it wasn't until I was actually in the OB program that I really realized that a research lifestyle is what I wanted to do. It's funny, my cohort mate and I would always joke that academia is a lifestyle choice, not a job necessarily. And so I learned that I loved the research. And I also found it really interesting that despite the fact that we've made a lot of progress in society about gender equity issues, there's still some persistent problems that we haven't resolved yet. And that's what sparked my interest in studying this area.
Thanks for sharing. Looking back, however many years ago, I was...
Too many.
Yeah. You were a first-year PhD student at Carnegie, and I was on the market to be a PhD student myself. And you let me stay in your place and told me all about what it's like to be a PhD student, and I really appreciated that. And now look at you, you're such an amazing scholar, published at AMJ and other top-tier journals.
It's kind of wild looking back. Like, I don't think I would have been able to predict the career trajectory. I feel really fortunate because everything has, the hard work has paid off. Because so often in the review and research process, things don't quite work out. And so this AMJ is a great example of like things can work out. So keep going.
That's amazing. And you touched a little bit more on that, but how did you get into conducting social networks related research?
Yeah, so this paper was actually my first kind of introduction to like networks focused research. So Catherine, my co-author on the paper, that's really her area of expertise. She studies a lot of psychological foundations of, networks and things like that. And so most of my expertise coming into this paper was related to gender differences in career advancement, and then also a lot of work on mentorship and sponsorship and how that happens in the workplace. And so we saw studying men and women's networks as sponsors as a potentially really nice meeting point between our two areas of expertise. And Catherine's also done more and more work on inequality in the workplace and diversity in the workplace. So it was basically a kind of a happy marriage of expertise. But one of the interests that I had was about how men and women provide sponsorship differently. So when you look at the research on career support more broadly, there's lots and lots of wonderful work on mentorship. It's like a really rich literature, and we know a lot of insights about mentorship, but newer work is pointing to the importance of understanding that sponsorship is something different. So there's this really great meta-analysis, Allen et al. From 2004, and they basically show that there's mentor behaviors and sponsor behaviors. And mentorship is things like people using their time and expertise to provide social support, help build skills, that sort of thing. And it's been linked to these subjective career benefits like increased confidence at work, competence, and things like that. But these sponsorship behaviors, like someone using their social capital to help identify career opportunities, make strategic introductions, like really tapping their network to help you. That's actually what's linked to objective career benefits like promotions, raises, moving up the corporate ladder. And so when I saw that data starting to emerge, and in that paper, they kind of pointed to the fact that like this is really important, like maybe we should be looking at these separately. And that sparked some newer work that I've been doing as well and studying, well, what's the psychology of sponsors? How might this be different than what we know about mentors? Because the resource is riskier, right? One is time and, expertise, which is obviously still valuable, but people feel differently about that than when they're talking about their reputation and their social network and their social capital. And so I became really interested in, well, how do men and women think about providing this really valuable type of resource for others in the workplace? And we know a lot about how people do it for themselves. So like most of social network research looks at how people activate ties for their own career advancement, but we don't really know as much about how it happens for others. And there could be some reasons that the mechanisms could be the same, but also you could build theory for why it wouldn't be. And so that was kind of my interest, is that I wanted to better understand what's the sponsor's perspective here. And because sponsorship is about social capital, you have to consider networks. And so that's kind of what sparked our goal there. And Catherine had some prior work that suggested that, the goals that you have really have a big impact on how you think about using your networks. And so that's what got us interested in looking at sponsors' goals specifically.
That's great. Thank you for sharing.
I think you already touched on this question, but so any like particular puzzle experience that made you first curious about this specific question that you tried to answer in the paper?
Yeah, so I think kind of two ways. So I like to do research both motivated by phenomenon that I see in the real world, and then also look to literature for guidance in terms of the theories that people have developed and all of that. But I'm a big phenomenon-driven researcher. If I observe something in the world that I think is interesting, that's what sparks the research questions I develop. And so I've had great experiences with sponsors, both male and female sponsors. Actually, in my market research job, my supervisor that I had, she was fantastic. So she went out of her way to help me shadow her at important meetings with clients, gave me opportunities to interact with clients, and, basically all of the good sponsorship that you could do, she did for me. And so she went beyond just mentorship too. And that was the first time I had experienced that. And then I also had, great advisors at Tepper who also provided both mentorship and sponsorship. So I had experienced all of it personally. But, over the years, I had talked to people about how they made decisions, and faculty members, whenever you talk to them about, well, how do you advocate for students on the job market? They all have really unique opinions about like what should be done, what shouldn't be done, like what's a useful technique versus what's not a useful technique. And I found that interesting, like there wasn't a lot of convergence, like people had really unique opinions about this, which suggested that there was some underlying goal-based differences, opinions about, what behaviors are most impactful for like in terms of how it's going to influence other people. And so there was definitely some variance there that I was observing. So that's what kind of sparked some of my interest.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing.
Diving more into the paper, can you tell us more about the revision process itself? So what you began investigating as the initial idea and what versus what we see in print now?
Yeah, so this is actually great because the review process at AMJ was really constructive. So the review team and also the AE did a really great job in pushing us to develop the paper better. So as some context is, this paper is, the running joke between Catherine and I is that this is like, it was such a long paper, like we started the paper when I was still in grad school. And then there was like a pandemic, and Catherine had 2 babies. And then I also got married. And so there's been like multiple life events between like the starting this paper and ending this paper. We first actually, when we wrote it up, we sent it to OBHDP, and it was a really different framing of the paper. We had some qualitative data in there that was like interesting, but it wasn't like a perfect fit for studying the phenomenon. And it was just, it did not go well, got rejected. The feedback was useful, but it was like not a good fit, clearly. And so we collected a little bit more data, but then we did some, reframing, and we sent it to AMJ thinking like, odds of getting a revision at AMJ are so low. We're just like, what the hell? Might as well try. And then they gave us a revision, which we were shocked by, but really excited. And one of the pieces of feedback that they pushed us on was this idea of, well, what actually is different about the goals that men and women are experiencing? So in our initial drafts, we really just focused on the number of goals, because that's so well established in goal setting theory and that research that when you have a greater number of goals, it's cognitively more challenging to achieve them. And so that connection is so well established in the goals literature. That's really all we were focusing on, is we had some evidence showing that women had a greater number of goals. But at that point, that was all we did. And then it was the reviewers were saying that, well, it seems like there's some evidence that it's really the goal content that also is important here. So the number of goals is one dimension, but the content of goals and the fact that goal conflict might become more likely when you have greater numbers of goals and conflicting kind of ideas about what you should be doing with your goals, that adds this complexity experience. And so that prompted us to do a lot of content coding of goal statements. So part of our data is we have participants basically write down their goals like freehand of what they would do in a sponsorship situation. And then we just content coded it for a whole bunch of different dimensions. It's pretty exploratory. And that was really important shift, because it revealed to us that it wasn't just the number of goals that was different, but there were some unique dimensions that were different as well. But it wasn't in like the broad gendered way that we originally theorized. So we thought that there would be broader gender differences in terms of warmth and agency and that kind of classic difference. But we didn't really see many differences pop out along those dimensions. What consistently showed up was this idea that the goals were more self-benefit oriented when male sponsors wrote them compared to female sponsors. So men tended to write goals that when as sponsors would also benefit their own career advancement. And that was the one that kind of consistently showed up. But that content coding of the goal statements, like the AMJ reviewers prompted us to do that. So that was a great way to further develop the paper that we hadn't kind of initially thought about. And it also prompted us to run kind of a more confirmatory test. So that's our study 2. We ran that in the review process. And I think it really strengthened the paper. It provided a more in-depth understanding of like what these goals actually are beyond just having more is harder. It's actually the content of them that's making them more complicated. So I think that was a really important shift, and I credit the review process for that. And then the other really important thing was towards the end of the review process, when it was conditionally accepted, the AE did a really great job of helping us like really develop our theoretical discussion at the very end of the paper in terms of highlighting important directions for future research, like how this advances theory. We had done kind of more of a just summarizing the findings type of style. And she was great in pushing us, saying like, I think you can do more, like help us understand what we now know. What are some fruitful directions for future research? What does this tell us about sponsorship theory? And so I think that was also a really important shift that the review process pushed us to do. But it was challenging. Reviewers can be difficult to please, but generally I think they were pretty reasonable, and it was very constructive, which doesn't always happen in the review process. I've also had very negative experiences, but this one was positive. So.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. That's super encouraging and very fascinating to see how the review process shaped the paper so much in so many different ways.
And how many rounds did you have at AMJ?
2, I believe. Yes, I think it was 2. So we had like major R&R and then another R&R. And then we actually went 2 rounds in the conditional accept as well. So yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so there was like that second conditional accept round that the AE helped push us more on kind of the writing side of things. And I hadn't heard of AMJ doing this, but I do know other journals do it as well. So I know ASQ is very notorious for kind of like once papers hit that acceptance stage, they work with the authors a lot and fine tuning the writing. And it's, I think one of the reasons why those are often like really well written papers. And so it was very like new for us to experience that side of things with AMJ, but I think it made the paper a lot better. So I'm glad the AE pushed us on that.
That's great. Yeah, I haven't heard of that before. In my experience, when you get a conditional accept, it's pretty much it. You don't expect to keep going, but that's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the data was all done. It was just kind of like framing and writing stuff at that point, which I agree. I think most editors, that's kind of treated as secondary, which is true. Like the data and the analyses, like that's really the core of the research. But I think what it made me pause and reflect on is that how we communicate it is as important as well in terms of the, the ideas we want readers to walk away from the paper with. So, yeah.
And this is off script, so feel free to ignore the question. But
okay.
In the acknowledgement, I saw that you mentioned that you used AI to clean up at the end the paper itself. Was that part of the conditional accept?
No. So AMJ, I think, or AOM has like rules about generative AI. So I don't use generative AI in any of my initial writing at all. But it is like a very affordable copy editor is how I've used it. So once the paper was completely ready, it was a little long and wordy. And so I used the generative AI tools to help kind of just streamline the language and stuff. I've used human copy editors too, which are great, but they're often very busy and expensive. And so that's when I think Gen AI can be helpful for that. I think, yeah, so that's like, I think the one use of the tool that is really great. My hope is though that people aren't using it to actually write. That would not be good.
Right. Yeah, I have thought about it before, but haven't used it. And I'm curious if you would recommend doing that.
I found it helpful. So one tool that I've used is Grammarly, and they have this kind of beta AI option where they will flag passive language, which I am just notoriously bad at. Like so many sentences were flagged in the draft. It was like red everywhere, and basically it just prompts you to say like, "Hey, this has kind of passive language framing, or your subject and verb are like really far apart. Like, do you want to maybe bring those a little bit closer?" And then it prompted me to reword some of the sentences into clearer writing. And then I think other tools like Claude and ChatGPT can do that as well if you specifically prompt them to help you with it. I would caution, people just because unless you have a closed loop program with ChatGPT, like UCSC has that, where they won't use any of our data to train. But if you're just using general ChatGPT and you like put your paper in there, it belongs to OpenAI now. So I think just, keep that in mind.
Just switching gears now and diving deeper into the paper itself. So we introduced the paper by saying that the paper talks about how women tend to see sponsorship more as an opportunity to benefit their protege, whereas men relatively place more emphasis on self-benefits. But there were no gender differences in sponsorship that would benefit the firm.
Yeah.
And we thought this was very interesting because we would have assumed that women would sponsor more when there is a clear benefit for the firm. So how did you interpret this finding, and how did you make sense of it?
Yeah, we were really surprised by this too. And so I'm glad you asked about it. So this is for the audience, this is our study 2 that primarily targeted this. In studies 1A and 1B, that's where we did a lot of the content coding of the goals, which provided some exploratory evidence that men were more likely to have these self-beneficial goals. And so we ran study 2 to provide a confirmatory test of this. And so we asked participants to rate a bunch of different dimensions of how important they felt, advocating when they're providing sponsorship, how important they felt it was to consider themselves or their protege's needs or the firm's needs. And we had a couple of different items for each of those. And so we were expecting to see that men would be more likely to see sponsorship as helping their own career advancement. So that would replicate what we saw in the goal statement coding, which is what we saw. And then we expected also that women would be relatively more likely to see the protege's outcomes as important, which is also what we saw. I do think it's important to note that we don't see kind of absolute differences here. It's all relative gender differences within these categories. Because sponsorship in and of itself is an other-oriented behavior. You are helping someone. So it would be it struck us as unlikely that men would see it as completely about themselves. Like that would be a fairly extreme response. In some way, it has to be sort of about the protege. But really how we interpret this evidence is men are really finding these like win-win type of sponsorship scenarios where it helps the protege, but then also like it really helps them as well. And we actually wrote a recent HBR article where we summarize some of this. And this is one point that we try to expand upon for kind of more of a practitioner-oriented audience of providing sponsorship. But anyway, we threw in that last item for the firm because we know a lot of companies do mentorship programs and talk about these issues, and benefiting the firm is kind of broadly other oriented, but it's not specifically other oriented. So we didn't have a strong prior as to how that would play out. We agreed with you that we thought it was possible that women would be more focused on the firm because it's other oriented, but we didn't have a really strong idea. And then when we saw there was no gender difference, it was intriguing. It's hard to theorize about a null effect, but my intuition based on kind of like all of the data that we have run that has made it into this paper and then other studies and things like that, my sense is that with female sponsors, the protege is just a very salient thing in front of them. The firm is kind of more generalized. And so it's really about like, you know, you and the protege are kind of the main salient people in this exchange. And some scholars have theorized that sponsorship is like a dyadic exchange. And so in that framework, it's really about, well, who in the dyad are you prioritizing? And then the firm kind of gets set to the sides a bit. And so I think one possibly interesting future direction would be to consider, could we link these other oriented tendencies about proteges to benefiting the firm? My main concern with that, though, is that if women are already providing sponsorship in a way that is possibly more costly to them, they're probably going to be more likely to also try to benefit the firm if prompted to do so. And that could create more inequities. So those are my initial thoughts on it. But again, it's kind of hard to theorize about a null response, but I think it's about the sponsorship as like this dyadic phenomenon that's really what's most salient in people's psychology when they're in these instances rather than the firm. So, but more work is needed. So listeners, please dive into that if you are interested in studying sponsorship.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. And it was a very super interesting effect, but I totally agree with you that it's very hard to theorize a null effect. So thank you for sharing whatever insights you did have about it.
Yeah, but I think that is one example of how, you know, an unexpected null effect can still be really informative. I'm a firm believer that with any gender paper or, you know, broadly about inequality, it's as important to know where there are inequities as it is to know where there are not. And so if we only publish evidence where we see gender inequity, this is a problem because then we don't know where it's not occurring. And if we want to get a complete picture of gender dynamics in the workplace, we need to know both sides of the story. So
that's actually super insightful to hear, because I never thought about the other way around, because that's always a question that you always read about those papers where people did find an effect, and it's harder to find papers where there are no effects to see.
Yeah, it's tricky because again, you didn't have to theorize about a null effect. And so there's a bit of rhetorical gymnastics that you have to do to get the reader interested into why not finding gender inequity is interesting. That's just kind of the challenges of the publication process, right? The audience has certain expectations about surprising findings and things like that. And so you have to learn how to manage that. But I personally think it's as important to know where there are not gender differences as there are.
So kind of a follow-up question to something that you mentioned just now. In study two, because you found that the men actually had both this benefiting themselves goal and benefiting others goal. In that sense, does that mean that men are also experiencing some kind of, goal conflict, goal complexity in a way that they want to do both versus women, they really prioritize? Sounds like they really prioritize benefiting others.
So in study two, we don't measure their goals. So I think that's a really important differentiation. So study two cannot be a perfect replication of studies 1A and 1B. 1A and 1B actually had them write down their goals. We measured how many there were. We coded the goal statements along a bunch of different dimensions about the content. What study 2 did was broaden the lens a bit to say, what are people broadly focusing on? How do they see sponsorship as an opportunity for advancing their own career, as an opportunity for advancing their proteges, or an opportunity for helping the firm? And so they weren't goal statements. And so I think that's important in that we could expect them to be correlated, but they're not exactly measuring the same thing. So it's not a perfect replication. But what we see in study 2 is that there are these relative gender differences. So when we look at the items that measure, do you see sponsorship as an opportunity for your own career advancement? Men are more likely to rate this highly compared to women. And then the effect flips on the item saying, to what extent do you see sponsorship as an opportunity to help your protege? Women rate that more highly than men. We also had them rank those items, and men are more likely to rank order sponsorship as an opportunity to benefit yourself more highly than the other ones. And so I think it's the relative differences that are really important to understand here. We would never claim that sponsorship could be only seen as about someone if you're doing sponsorship, it is inherently a helping behavior. And so there's going to be some aspects of it that are related to others. But my interpretation of this finding is that men are identifying basically win-win sponsorship opportunities, that meaning that can help them and their protege at the same time. And so it provides better goal alignment. That's my interpretation. So some examples of what this would look like in the real world is, say you have a protege who you want to give them an opportunity to, present a project update in front of the higher ups in your firm. So this is great for their visibility, gives them an opportunity to showcase some of their skills. And so you can do that in a couple different ways. You can, lobby other people in the group project to make sure they're all okay with this, advocate for your protege to be considered for this opportunity, and then, talk to people to kind of prepare them for this opportunity and all of those things. But at the same time, that is, a little assertive. You do have to put yourself out there to say, hey, I think my protege should do this. And we know with women that there are challenges when they engage in assertive behavior. They're more likely to be perceived negatively because people see it as inconsistent with gender role expectations. But for men, what a win-win sponsorship opportunity could look like is, I'm going to do all of this, and then the way I'm going to accomplish it is by lobbying a higher up in the firm who I also want to develop a better relationship with. And so you're then advocating for your protege in a way that also expands your network. And so it's a win-win opportunity. And so you have, I think, better goal alignment in that instance. Whereas for women, they're then balancing this issue of advocating for the protege, but then dealing with the challenges of, well, I have to maintain my own reputation and make sure that I don't ignite social backlash. And that's kind of what we get into study 3, where we explicitly prime them to be balancing the reputation with the protege's advancement. And that's what we link to this goal activation, the network activation outcomes. And so, so my interpretation is that men are finding this better goal alignment. But that being said, I think it's an open question, is what's the better way to provide sponsorship? I don't think women are doing it worse. I think they're doing it in a harder way, but some may argue it's more ethical in how they're doing it. They're thinking about the person they're helping, this is good, but it's also harder at the same time. And so I don't have a great solution for that yet. Stay tuned, future research. But I think it's important to flag that perhaps everyone could provide sponsorship in a win-win way. Maybe that's one way that we can try to alleviate some of this additional complexity that women are experiencing. Don't know if that answered your question, but that's kind of how we're interpreting the findings.
Yeah, this is very helpful. Yeah, that answers a lot. Thanks for doing that. And so the another kind of follow-up question you kind of already mentioned is that you highlight that women may carry a greater burden in sponsorship in the paper because they have they really care about benefiting their proteges and also activate denser networks. Does this suggest that women are actually, maybe they're doing more work in sponsorship, and this might be a reason that contributes to gender inequality in some sort of hidden ways?
Yeah, I think this is a really important point. So one limitation of this paper is that we are looking at hypothetical sponsorship scenarios that, limits our ability to get real insights to the field. But, the benefit of that is they're very clean tests. So, pros and cons. And so when I think about the costs of sponsorship, what our paper shows is that there's certainly a mental burden that women are shouldering at a higher level. Having to balance lots of different goals that are conflicting I would theorize that there are emotional dimensions of this, maybe different stress levels, maybe there's other sort of negative emotions that you could be experiencing that could impact, how you go about providing sponsorship. And I think even if it's not a traditional cost in terms of like a pay gap, additional mental load is, it's still costly. It impacts people's experiences on a day-to-day basis. So I think it's important to quantify in that way. My theorizing about sponsorship more broadly, I don't have data to speak to this, so I do want to be clear about that. This is just my expertise about all the data I've collected on sponsorship generally and my sense of the process. It's complicated. It's very nuanced. The effects don't always play out in exactly the way that you think. Sometimes it's inconsistent due to some moderator you haven't thought about. And I think one area of research that can help provide some insights to make sense of some of these inconsistencies is the negotiation literature. We do know from that work that when women are, overly assertive, they are penalized because people perceive them more negatively. But if they do that on behalf of other people, we don't see those same social backlash penalties. And I think that's really important because it flags this possibility where it's like, well, perhaps sponsorship could be something like that, where as long as it's coded by the audience as advocacy for someone else, maybe women won't experience these same social backlash penalties. But the question is, do women know that? Because, women are smart. They internalize a lot about the cues they get from the environment, how, positive versus negative reinforcement about how they behave. And so women sponsors may not know that people are going to be more forgiving of assertive sponsorship behavior because they know it's for someone else. And so I think this introduces an interesting idea of maybe there's some education opportunities around sponsorship. I think could imagine scenarios where firms try to destigmatize the idea of win-win sponsorship, that it doesn't have to be purely to benefit the protege. My main concern is that firms could inadvertently perpetuate inequitable sponsorship if they just issue broad calls for it. Because if they just encourage everyone, provide sponsorship, go do it, it's good. That's true. But if we look at how it naturally occurs, men are going to use it as an opportunity to advance their own career. So they're going to use sponsorship as a lever to go up in the organizational ladder. Women are going to use sponsorship with a focus on helping the protege and not costing themselves anything. And that's a stronger mental burden is what our data would suggest. And so when you kind of look at how that would compound over time, that could lead to providing sponsorship as a cost, which certainly I'd imagine most firms would not want. But I think that's theoretically how it could play out. I would love the opportunity to test this and with actually a firm. But as many of you know, getting, field collaborators is brutally hard. And so I think that's how inequitable sponsorship could play out in the field, but still, completely theoretical and untested. The other thing that Catherine and I have tossed around a bit is this idea of how the network activation links to sponsorship outcomes. So we know there's pros and cons about network density, right? One pro is that it could be helpful for these more relational goals, maybe. Like strong, dense cliques are really good for mobilizing social support, providing emotional support, things like that. And so perhaps it could feel like a safer bet to activate these mentally if you're worried about social costs when you're sponsoring. But we know from all of the great work on, structural holes and stuff that there's also costs to activating dense versus more sparse networks. You don't get the same level of novel information, and that novelty could be critical to finding the opportunities for your protege. And that could be what's important for highly effective sponsorship. But as far as we know, we haven't come across work that's actually tested network characteristics to sponsorship efficacy. So it's just kind of an open empirical question right now. But I think that's another way that it could play out that would be really cool to look at.
That's awesome. So many interesting future directions.
Yes, networks people listening, that's a great question. I think also there could be work that Raina Brands has done on brokerage and gendering and that. I think brokers could be highly effective sponsors. And so potentially there's some interesting questions there about, how men and women use their networks when they're in brokers versus not brokers positions, how that impacts how they sponsor. I think all really cool questions that could be asked.
Thank you.
How do you hope that this paper shifts the conversation on sponsorship, gender, and career advancement in organizations over the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, so I think my first thought is I would love for organizations to actually think about mentorship and sponsorship differently. I think a lot of firms broadly encourage leaders to provide this type of support without really any idea of how nuanced the differences are and how psychologically this experience is different for their leaders. And so I think some really interesting research could be done to kind of dig into this in the field, like what type of programs provide effective and equitable sponsorship. Because I think that the research I have seen shows that formal mentorship programs are not always as effective as informal ones. Like the types of career support dyads that emerge organically are often associated with more positive outcomes than the formal pairings. And so I don't think the answer is like formal sponsorship programs, although I think that would be really cool to test. So we know that for sure. I think the other thing I would love to see in the literature is continued differentiation between mentorship and sponsorship, which I'm continuing to do in my research, like various unpublished stuff. I think we know so much about mentorship now, and that's great. The challenge that a lot of the behaviors that specifically relate to social capital activation for others, which is this core idea of sponsorship, it's often been kind of averaged into a lot of these mentorship composites and variables, which is fine if you're studying how leaders provide career support generally, because in reality, like these aren't mutually exclusive. A leader can provide mentorship and sponsorship, but they can also only provide one or the other. But if we want to know the unique effects of these types of career support on, outcomes, then we need to differentiate between them. And there is some newer work looking at that from at least the protege's perspective. So like how receiving sponsorship is useful. Where I think more work can be done is separating between mentorship and sponsorship from the leader's perspective. So the psychological experience of that. I think there's important work that can be done there. So I have like an ongoing qualitative project where I talk to leaders about how they made decisions about providing sponsorship in the workplace and digging into how, like, what's people's psychological experience about mobilizing social capital for others. And I think that's an important thing that there's some, initial work on it, but there's still a lot of unanswered questions there. And I think we should dig into that more. But what would you all like to see? What kind of unanswered questions do you have about sponsorship and gender equity in the workplace?
That's a great question. The first thing that comes to mind is, so I study referrals, right, and issues around nepotism and cronyism. I wonder, how do these differentiate from sponsorship? Are they a different form of sponsorship?
I think this is a really great point. So I have one paper in AMD actually that looks at Supreme Court clerkship data, and we frame it within the job referrals literature. And so I think job referrals can be a type of sponsorship. But I think what your work points out, which is a really important idea, is that, when is sponsorship fair and equitable and when is it not, in terms of who gets it and what it means for access to opportunities. Because one argument is that it's not equitable because it's using these resources like networks to benefit people in a way that not everyone has access to it. And so I think that's a really important question. Like, is it fair? When is it fair? My sense is like, networks are inevitable. I remember I was talking to Brandy Avon at Tupper about this. She goes, networks run the world. And I'm like, yeah, they do. It's like you see this over and over again, and that I think it's important to know the rules, then you can be successful. But I think this is an interesting area of research about, also how do people perceive these things. And so, yeah, so I would categorize referrals as a type of sponsorship with the caveat that it could certainly be provided in unfair or fair ways. So.
Yeah, very interesting.
I think we've partially covered what we wanted to ask you next, which is what next questions about sponsorship are you most excited to pursue? We also wanted to get your thoughts on specifically, like in your paper, you argue more from a cognitive lens, but you say that the social capital lens requires a bit more investigation. So as you've mentioned, I think that's something you plan on doing, especially through your qualitative work. And is there anything upcoming that we should be looking out for?
Yeah, so Catherine and I have some like in progress work where we're looking at, so this project she's leading, we take kind of a social perceptual lens to look at how mentorship and sponsorship behaviors are gendered and how they're perceived, and then how that might impact people's decisions to provide mentorship or sponsorship. And so that's some work. It's under review, so I won't give any more details other than that. But but I think your idea about kind of the cognitive versus other perspectives is important and interesting. I think there's kind of some unanswered questions about the emotional side of sponsorship. So we took a cognitive lens in the AMJ paper, and I think with social capital activation, a cognitive lens could also certainly be appropriate. I think it's less common because social capital has often been examined from more of a structural networks perspective. And it's newer work that's pulling in these micro foundations and, individual agency and impacting network formation. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity there to understand it from more of a meso or multi-level perspective. But one dimension I think is the socio-emotional aspect of it. Like, what are the emotional processes that leaders experience when they provide sponsorship, or are, mobilizing their social capital? Like, as far as I know, if there is papers about this, I would love to read them. But I have not come across a lot of work that links social capital mobilization to these like emotional dimensions. But we know emotions in the workplace are so important. And so this feels like a really problematic gap. I know there's some work from Smith that has looked at it from a racial lens and looking at how providing job referrals within like Black urban communities, the kind of concerns that might come up about, if I provide this job referral, are they going to reinforce stereotypes that I'm worried about? And so there's some complex psychological experiences there, but it hasn't really been tested as much in the realm of gender. So I think that could be interesting. I have one student that's really interested I'm working with now on this idea of gendered cognitive labor and like unpaid domestic work and the emotional dimensions of that. And I think that's another really interesting idea of how that could link to providing career support, because we know that stuff spills over into workplace experiences. So those are all some really interesting things that I'm currently working on. But yeah, I think the socio-emotional side of it could be really interesting to dig into more.
That's super cool. And it looks like you have a really nice array and portfolio of what's about to come. And that's super exciting to see.
Yeah, and I think Catherine's work also highlights the importance of emotions in network activation. And she kind of differentiates between affect and emotions and shows that is important. And so I think this is like an area that we could really benefit from, like developing more in the networks literature.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
But it's hard when you have more micro people and then macro people who approach problems from a really different perspective. And sometimes finding common language can be challenging. But that's why I think taking a multi-level perspective is really valuable, especially when you're studying something like inequality.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And final question.
Yeah.
In light of your findings, how do you anticipate adjusting your own sponsorship practices moving forward?
This is a great question. Yeah, I find that I'm like hyper aware of my sponsorship now when I'm providing it. I'm like, as I'm typing a letter of recommendation, I'm like, what are my goals right now? I'm like, then I'm like, wait, this is not productive. Like I shouldn't. And so it's funny. I think sometimes it veers into like I'm over analyzing it now because I'm so aware of the research evidence for it. I think one thing I've really tried to consider is trying to destigmatize my own tendencies to provide sponsorship in completely selfless ways. I think I certainly fell into that category of where I thought sponsorship, originally I was like, it has to be completely about the protege. It's about them, not you, blah, blah, blah. And again, like there's no wrong way to do this. If that makes your heart sing and you feel fulfilled doing sponsorship that way, more power to you. But writing this up paper made me reflect on, well, maybe that's a little extreme. Like perhaps there's opportunities for me and my protege to both advance our careers at the same time. And maybe that could actually strengthen our relationship if we're both getting the, advancement opportunities together. So I've tried to pay attention to, like I talk to my students and, various people that I'm considering providing sponsorship with about what their goals are, so that I can keep an eye out for opportunities that are like win-win stuff for both of us. But then also like if there's something like a letter of recommendation or something where I'm like, yeah, I don't get any benefit out of it, but I know it'll help them. I frame it as a pay it forward type of thing in my head. But yeah, so I think the one change is thinking about like talking to people about their goals and then using that as a way to help identify win-win situations. It's almost like you break it into kind of a two-step process as opposed to trying to balance it all at the same time. that's my sense is what creates all the complexity. Is like when you're trying to keep too many things in your head at the same time, that's what really impacts your ability to achieve those goals. And so my hope is maybe breaking it down into a multi-step process that you do one at a time could help. But again, all theoretical, have not tested it. So stay tuned in like 10 years. I can give you my own anecdotal evidence of whether it's worked or not.
Yeah, we should plan to talk again in 10
Yeah.
years. Yeah, exam approved. Well, thank you so much for all of your insights. We learned so much, and I'm sure all of our audience really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much for hosting this podcast too. I think, like I said in the beginning, it's so helpful to hear the behind the scenes perspective on research and the peer review process, because often it seems very opaque when you're a junior in your career, especially as a PhD student. And so I'm sure all your listeners really appreciate it. So thank you guys for doing this.
We loved chatting with Elizabeth about her recently published paper with Catherine Shea. We learned a lot about the topic and got great advice on sponsorship and the review process at AMJ.
If you liked today's episode, please like and subscribe to our podcast, and we look forward to getting your feedback.
If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to email us at communications.sns@gmail.com. We look forward to touching base with you.